Welcome to the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm your host, Robin L. Owens, PhD, and this is where we dive in each week to give advice, tools, and tips for high-achieving, purpose-minded women who've written nonfiction books and want to amplify their message beyond the book. I'm a college professor, and when I'm not doing that, I am speaking, coaching, mentoring, and teaching high-achieving women who have written books how to use their books to make a bigger difference, have more impact, and purpose. Okay, let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm so glad you're here and listening into the podcast. I appreciate you for taking time out of your busy schedule and day and night and listening to the podcast. And today I'm talking with Claire Chandler. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Claire. Claire is the author of many books, but the one I want to highlight here is The Whirlpool Effect, Inspire the Flow that boosts company performance. And we'll hear more about that later. And let me tell you more about Claire. She's the president and founder of Talent Boost, and she specializes in aligning HR and business leaders so they can deliver strategic outcomes both today and in the future. She taps into over 25 years of experience in people leadership, human resources, and business ownership to help leadership teams work together more effectively in less time with less cultural resistance so they can accelerate their business growth and so much more. Welcome, Claire Chandler.
Thank you, Robin. I love that introduction. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so looking forward to our conversation. So let's just jump right in. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit, I read your kind of formal bio introduction, but why don't you tell us in your own words first, a little bit about yourself and then about your work?
Absolutely. So your intro was great. I am a lifelong Jersey girl, so self-professed. I do live along the Jersey Shore, but I'm Snooki. Have met the situation in case people want to know. So he does actually live in my town, oddly enough. So that's a little bit of me. I'm born and raised in New Jersey. My husband and I, like I said, live along the shore. And I am a corporate survivor. So I spent the majority of my career in corporate America, most recently as the vice president of human resources for a large, complex global organization. And so I kind of walk the talk in terms of helping leaders both in HR and in the broader business. I call myself a leadership advisor. I'm really kind of like an executive therapist. And I say that because more often than not, my clients, when speaking with me one-on-one, will get to a point where they just sort of unload, and not on me, but to me, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think so many leaders have discovered and do realize as they ascend in an organization that it is very lonely. There's a reason that is a cliche, that it is lonely at the top, right? And a lot of leaders, especially at the executive level, just don't feel like they can be vulnerable or truly open about what they fear, what they struggle with, what they don't know. And so I provide them an outlet for doing that on a one-on-one level. And then as a group, I get them together and kind of get them a little bit better aligned and bought into the shared strategy and the shared mission so that they truly can accelerate that growth journey.
Yeah, that sounds like a much needed service. And so you make a distinction between the advisor and the therapeutic role because you're not just giving advice. You're taking time to listen. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. It's a little bit of thought partnership. A lot of executives, especially in the HR space. So I do advise a lot of chief HR officers and chief people officers. They are looking for someone who has been in their shoes, who kind of gets the struggle in the role that they have been put in to accomplish, right? Which is really to align better the HR resources, the strategies, and the people with where the business is trying to go. And so, even for them, they are also executive leaders. They also have struggles. They also have frustrations. They have as much of a challenge navigating the corporate politics above their team and then filtering throughout their team the right messages at the right time to keep their people motivated. And, they too struggle with how much do they let their team in on what they are challenged by and what they are afraid of, and where they have doubts about the future, both of their team and in their organization. So it is quite interesting. And it starts out in an advisory mode, but it almost always kind of dips into a little bit of that therapy.
Yes, yes, makes perfect sense. And you mentioned earlier that you basically left corporate life and work, right? And so now you're working in your own business, as we read, the founder of your company. And so I say that to kind of frame our conversation, because I think lots of the women who are listening now have done the same, started their own business. And like you, I know you've written a few books, and they have written at least one or in the process of one, but I think most of the listeners are authors. And so later on, I'll just ask you some questions about your author self. But right now, I want to hear more about the Whirlpool Effect, your first book that we decided we'll talk about here today.
It actually was the first book that I published. I have published a few books since then, but someone the other day asked me, which has been your favorite? And I come back to this one for a couple of reasons. And I think your audience will appreciate, the first book is the hardest, right? And so for me, the Whirlpool Effect is both an outcome of great leadership, and it's also a metaphor and kind of a childhood memory. So I'll kind of explain through a story first. So as I said, I'm born and raised New Jersey. The summers here are quite hot and humid. And I was not the kid with the pool in the backyard. I was not that kid. But one of my very good friends, who continues to be one of my closest friends today, had a pool in her backyard. So of course, on hot summer days, that's where all the kids in the neighborhood would congregate. So I would take my big yellow banana board and balance it on my knees as I pedaled up the street to her house. I don't know why I thought bringing the banana board was going to be relevant to this sort of small swimming pool, but that's what I did. And we would all, just sort of gather in her backyard in the pool and cool off. And eventually, every time, someone would just sort of shout Whirlpool. And we all knew what that meant. And we immediately stopped splashing around, and we just followed each other for a few laps in a circle around the pool. And then after a few laps, we could pick up our feet and just get carried along with the current. And it was such a cool thing. And I don't know who invented that as a kid in a pool, but every pool I was ever in, somebody, would shout Whirlpool, and we would just, here we go. And as I was writing the book, it didn't start out to be the Whirlpool Effect, but I was looking for, and again, your audience will appreciate this, what's going to be the hook, right? What's going to be the analogy? What's going to be the metaphor that people will attach better meaning to? And I just had this flash of memory. And I thought, what a great metaphor for great leadership, right? There's this sort of simple, clear message that everybody can get behind, this one word Whirlpool, that the people who heard it immediately understood what that meant, could visualize what success looked like, and then enthusiastically contributed their whole heads, hands, and hearts to achieving that outcome. And then they could celebrate as a group once they fulfilled that mission or that purpose. And I don't mean to attach too much weight to the childhood game of creating a whirlpool in a swimming pool, but the analogy was so strong and it stayed with me, and it became the central theme of the book.
I love that. I love that. I love that you connected a central part of who you are, because that was a significant experience in your life.
That's right.
And to share it in that way, that helps others. I love that. I love that. It's great. So you kind of told us, but now tell us, in other words, the premise or the main point of the book.
Yeah. So the main point, honestly, is that great performance, business performance, team performance, individual performance starts at the top of an organization. I firmly believe that leaders shape culture. And a lot of leaders mistakenly believe that culture just sort of emanates from the ground level and is sort of crowdsourced. And I have found in my experience that the opposite is true, that leaders truly shape and impact culture. People watch what behaviors get rewarded, what personalities get advanced, who gets to go to the executive wing. And so the central premise of the book is, as leaders, and it is written to leaders, if you are looking at your business and seeing underperformance, you're seeing turnover, you're seeing drama and conflict, stop looking outside of yourself and take ownership of the fact that the way that you are leading is not creating the whirlpool effect. And that's a hard message for a lot of leaders to hear, right? Because it's, well, what do you mean I'm doing something wrong or not doing enough of something right? But the good news to that is, if it's within you that you're causing the problem, it is completely within your control to fix. And so the book kind of goes on to talk about some of the ways that you can do that.
Yes, that makes so much sense. And I'm guessing not the answer, but let me ask you the question anyway. Does this also apply to not just larger organizations, but I'm thinking about consultants, business owners, authors who have small teams, 2 or 3 or 10, or just a small team? Does the same impact? You see the same impact with the smaller teams as you do with the larger?
I do. And I appreciate the question, because I actually think the impact is bigger in smaller organizations. It's funny, and I'll share this with you since this is a very book-centric and author-centric podcast. I have been thinking for years, and I want to replicate your storyboard model behind you, but I've been thinking for years of the sequel to the Whirlpool Effect being called the Ripple Effect, and I haven't written it yet. But the premise to that is the ripple effect of a bad decision, whether it's a bad hire, a bad investment, a delay in addressing bad performance, bad behavior. The ripple effect in a small organization with a bad decision is far greater than in a large one, right? Because a large organization is built to absorb a one-off bad decision, an under-functioning or poorly behaving employee. They can absorb a lot of that. So I love that your question came up for you, because I think it is very important for leaders of smaller practices, of smaller organizations, to understand that the pressure is on for them to make sure they get those decisions right.
Yes, yes. And so I love that. I'm glad you're going to do that. I'm all for it. I'm rooting for you for that sequel.
Well, I know. So now I just called myself out, because I sort of went away from that premise, but I think I need to come back to that and get drafting, right?
I think you're onto something there for sure. Absolutely. I'm sure you probably experienced the ripple effect. Is there an example that comes to mind? If not, it's okay. But is there an example of the ripple effect, even though we know you're still thinking through and working on the book?
Yeah, so there is, unfortunately, and it did lead to the demise of a smaller company. So I advise larger, complex organizations, but throughout my years of kind of building up my brand and my reputation as an advisor, I started with smaller companies and startups. And there was one in particular that was a relatively young organization. It was a very small team of about 10 people. And the leader of that team was somebody who I really grew to love and respect as a human being. This was somebody who was very values driven, a very soulful person, and somebody who wanted to build a great company, not just for the legacy that would leave in his business persona, but also the example he was setting for his family and his young children. And unfortunately, he had a lot of these symptoms of what the Whirlpool Effect book addresses, which was, high turnover, bad underperformance, kind of bad behavior, a lot of drama and conflict. And the problem was that he was very well intentioned about building a great company, but constantly backed away from the more difficult conversations, was not able to really stand in his own conviction of addressing behavior, bringing it back in line with his values and the mission of the company. And ultimately, the company went out of business. And I do attribute that to this sort of ripple effect of making poor decisions, sometimes making bad hires, but you can't always tell that in the first 90 to 180 days. So it's what you do to correct that performance and correct that behavior and bring it back in line with the values that he so clearly held, but sort of, was incapable or sort of unwilling to address. And so it's a very painful example of what happens with the ripple effect when a company or its leaders don't address what they know to be wrong and know to violate their, set of beliefs.
Yeah. And you said a key word there, what they know to be wrong. Yeah. That I think is a critical piece of that. All right. So how did you come to write the book? It sounds like it comes out of your experience, but, tell us more about that. How'd you come to do this?
So you want to know the process or how I decided I was going to write a
How
book?
you just the idea, yeah, the idea.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about the process, you can. But
Yeah, so it's interesting. Before I wrote the book, I'd been running workshops at conferences and just sort of public speaking with groups of employees from different companies, all about how to reignite your passion for your job, right? And kind of taking them through sort of this journey of, self-awareness and understanding, what you're doing. Are you passionate about it? If you're not, is there a way to rekindle that? And what I was finding was those workshops were really well received, and I was getting employees fired up to go in and have better conversations with their managers in their companies about how they could better align what they were doing with what fueled them.
yes.
The problem was I was sending them back into companies under leaders who were not as enlightened and were not equipped to have those conversations and to think about their people in more flexible ways, in aligning them with their fast lanes, in giving them responsibilities that also aligned with their personal reward system and their motivations. And so I got them all fired up. I sent them out the door, and then they got frustrated because I sent them back into organizations that just didn't get it. And so that was sort of an epiphany for me to say, I'm starting at the wrong end of the organization. And that is not to say that, the frontline employee is not worthy of development, is not worthy of having the conversation. But if they are in an environment that is not receptive to really turning on the light within them, right, and giving them that environment to contribute their whole heads, hands, and hearts, then it's sort of acting at cross purposes. And so I made an intentional decision to start then talking directly to the leaders at the top of an organization, much more directly. And I did that through intentionally pivoting the focus of my business and who I was going after in terms of prospective clients. But then I really kind of stood on that platform of, this is going to be my book that sort of raises the warning bell to these leaders to say, I'm going to come knocking on your door and we're going to talk about this, because the key to changing that and the key to addressing the poor behavior and the workplace misery that your people are crying on my shoulder about is within you to fix. And so let's go do that. So that was really kind of what was the impetus behind writing that book.
Yes, and I'm inspired by that. Listening to that whole story, I'm so passionate about people having meaningful experiences at work. And to hear that you're doing that work and that you decided this was a better route to start with and wrote the book. I love that. Love that. All right. So now let's talk about your author hat, because like many of the listeners, you have different hats. You have this business owner and author and so many other, right? All right. So let's talk about your author hat. What would you say is could be talking about promoting, because most of your books are all out now, except for this new one that's coming. So,
right, which apparently I'm going to start writing tonight. Yes.
Apparently, I shall soon. All right. So what would you say is your biggest challenge, or was your biggest challenge as an author?
I would say, and again, the first book was the most meaningful for me because it was the hardest to get started. And I think the biggest hurdle for me was getting over the concept of writing the book, right? And I think so many authors sort of struggle with that. It is sort of this concept of, and if you're living in America, there's sort of this, writing the great American novel. And you and I think, and most of your audience are really focused on writing nonfiction. For me, it's very business focused, right? But I put all this pressure on myself to write the book, the treatise that I could stand on as the epitome of my brand and my reputation and my beliefs and all of that. And I sought some counsel. I sought, a sounding board who kind of said, you're really overthinking this, right? And that's not the first time someone had accused me of overthinking. I tend to do that, but he said, you're thinking about this all wrong. This is not going to be the only book you ever write. So focus just on writing a book that is centered on something you truly believe in, and follow a process to get that done. So for me, that was the biggest hurdle, was getting out of my own way, which is kind of funny because that's what I specialize in when I advise leaders, right? Is to get out of their own way. But it's really to get out of my own way and get over myself that I was going to write the book.
Right. Yeah, I like that. A book instead of the book.
It's such a tiny little word that we had to flip, but it made all the difference for me.
Yeah, a powerful awareness. All right. So on the other side of it, what was your greatest, or is your greatest joy as an author?
There are so many, right? There's sort of the rush of accomplishment when that first stack of books that you get in the mail, because the first person to purchase my book was me. So to see that and to kind of unwrap it and to unveil it and say that this is a tangible, living, breathing sort of product of that came out of my head and my experience and my beliefs. So there's the joy in that. But I think, quite honestly, my bigger joy is when I give away one of my books to a leader who has either inspired me or influenced me in some way. And it's always interesting to me, because I will give out copies of my book, and I'll write just a handwritten note that's sort of a personal connection between me and that leader. And I always hear back from that leader, like, that it moved them. Mm-hmm. And that, for me, like, I would rather just give away copies of my book and get sort of that, affirmation that it made a difference to them, than sell thousands of copies of a book to people that I'm never going to hear from.
Yes. That makes so much sense to me. And you kind of alluded to this in your story about the metaphor, but in what way does your book reflect a part of who you are?
Yeah, I did kind of allude to that. I think it's interesting, because just the process of writing the book and getting out of my own way is very aligned, like I said, with my practice of helping leaders do the same, helping teams do the same, remove obstacles that are sort of self-imposed and not really there. For me, I think it comes back to that metaphor of the whirlpool, because I think as we get older, and especially as we ascend in our professional career, we get further and further removed from that childlike enthusiasm about what we do. And it is so key to living a life of fulfillment, to really tap into, some would call it your inner 5-year-old, right? But really this sort of notion of, what are the things that you do that light you up? What are the things that remind you of, drawing with crayons when you were a kid and getting lost in that and losing complete track of time? And I think more leaders and more employees in general need to get back to what it is that fills them with pure joy. Because I think so many times, especially in corporate cultures, unfortunately, we get to a point where we are sort of stuffed into a very tightly lidded box, and we're told conformity is the path to success. And I completely don't think that's true, which is one of the reasons I left corporate, because I happen to be a little quirky, a tad goofy, mildly sarcastic. And those are things that, they ended up serving me well. I mean, I had a very successful corporate career, but I found that I was constantly having to walk a line that conformed, versus just sort of, letting me play with my crayons. And now I have a business that allows me to do that. So I think the writing of the book, the metaphor of the book, the business that I do, the leaders that I try to help and nurture, kind of all come into this alignment of, find ways to be as authentic as possible and lean into what lights you up. Because if you lead from or give from or work from a place of scarcity, it's going to be reflected in what you do and the enjoyment you get from it.
Yes, I resonate with that so much. And a lot of your message resonates with my message too. That is, but I'm trying to refrain and stay on track with this interview. But
that's all right. Let it fly.
Many ideas and inspiration coming as you're talking. But okay, let me focus, Robin, focus. Okay. All right. So speaking of focus, let's think about the listener right now. And the listener is purpose-minded, high-achieving women, written nonfiction books that we talked about earlier. And they want to make a difference. So now, based on your experience and your expertise, either from your life, your work, your experience, your wisdom, any area of your life or work, what's something you would say to them to kind of encourage them or support them or advise them in any way?
There are so many things that I could say to kind of flatten the learning curve that I've kind of stumbled along in my journey. But I think the biggest one would be, get over that voice in your head that is telling you, who do you think you are, right? Who are you to think you have a message that others want to hear? Who are you to think that, if you wrote a book, anyone would care? And that kind of goes back to one of my lessons too, which is if you're writing your book to be a bestseller, if you're writing it to get, external validation that you're worthy, you're writing it for the wrong reasons. Write it from a place of pure belief and what you know to be true, and just share that with the world, because that's what the world needs more of, is that, again, that sharing from abundance. But that's the biggest thing I would say to your audience is get over that voice in your head, because that's imposter syndrome rearing its ugly head and telling you you are not good enough, you are not worthy, and no one's going to listen to you. They may not. No one may read your book, no one may buy your book, but that shouldn't be why you do it. So get over that voice in your head that's talking you out of it.
Yes, yes. And I can imagine that voice coming into play once the book is done and it's time to promote it and get it out into the world, because that's a different level of
It's so scary, right? I mean, just to kind of jump on that, because I can remember that first book, and it kind of lessened with each one. It is equal parts thrilling and frightening to release a book. Like, to write a book is exciting and it can be frustrating, and we both know that. But getting it out into the world, especially a nonfiction book, is the most, I think, one of the biggest ways to express vulnerability and to demonstrate vulnerability that we have, right? And women are brilliant at being vulnerable. We really are. We are not brilliant at making sure that our needs are met first, right? And so there's sort of this duality going on there. But yeah, just releasing a book is, I think, just a brilliant expression of vulnerability. And since women are just such great role models for vulnerability, just lean into that process and just, take it for the roller coaster ride that it is, but just go do it.
Yeah, it's definitely a roller coaster ride for sure. All right. So, the title of the podcast is Leadership Purpose. So, in your thinking, is this idea of having a sense of purpose in your work important, or for people to have purpose in their work important? If not, why not?
Yeah, it is absolutely important. It is so core to my belief as a person, my purpose as a business is to be very mission driven. It's interesting. My husband is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. And one of the many things that we have in common is that we are very mission driven, and they could be different missions. Obviously, you have different missions or purposes throughout your life, but we both fundamentally believe that a purpose is at your core, right? And it also is your horizon. So it's kind of deep within you, and it's also outside of you, and it's something you continue to strive for and kind of measure yourself against. So yeah, I can't emphasize enough. In fact, one of the programs that I do with my clients is called Growth on Purpose, and it really is this sort of framework that guides leaders and organizations through how to grow from a central place of a clearly defined magnetic purpose. So I mean, I could talk for hours about just the importance of purpose, but yes, it would be an understatement to say I completely agree that purpose is important.
Yes. And magnetic. What was the phrase you used?
Magnetic. Yeah, it's got to be clearly defined and magnetic, right? So it can't just be clearly articulated. It has to be something that people attach meaning to. And again, kind of that metaphor of the Whirlpool effect, it has to be so simple and so easy to grasp, just like shouting the word whirlpool in the middle of a swimming pool, that people immediately understand what you mean, what success looks like, and that they cannot wait to contribute to fulfilling it.
Yes. So inspiring. All right. As you mentioned, you can talk about purpose, and I'm so inspired by this conversation. I can keep it going all day, but we both know that you don't have time to be here all day, and I'm guessing our listeners might be ready to move along too. So, but before we tell people how they can get in touch with you, is there anything you want to share that I just didn't think to ask you or didn't get a chance to ask you?
Oh gosh, there's probably so many other things, but no, I mean, I just think all of what we already touched upon, especially for your audience of high achieving, high ambition women who are also high nurturers and super vulnerable, lean into all of those, because those are not weaknesses, those are strengths.
Yes. I mean, that's a good final word. All right. So I'm imagining they're saying, where can we hear more? How can we know more? So how can they be in touch with you?
So 2 easy ways to do that. Go to my website, which is clairechandler.net. and there's some great resources on there. And then I hang out quite a bit on LinkedIn. So please don't hesitate to come over there, connect, and say hello.
Okay, that's wonderful. And we'll have that in the show notes. Claire Chandler, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your enthusiasm, and your heart for leaders and growth. Really appreciate you.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure to be here.
Okay, everyone. And if you want to reach me, you can reach me at my website at robinlowens.com. I too, like Claire, hang out on LinkedIn mostly, and you can find me there or anywhere on social media at Robin L. Owens, PhD, Robin L. Owens, PhD. And if you're an author and you want to amplify your book even further, and you've been thinking about turning it into a course, go over to my other website and grab my free training on how to turn your book into a masterful course. And you can find that at createmasterfulcourses.com, createmasterfulcourses.com, createmasterfulcourses.com. And I'll see you there. And until next time, this is Dr. Robin. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. If you enjoyed it, head on over and rate and subscribe so you never miss an episode. New episodes drop every week, and I can't wait to hang out with you again soon. Meanwhile, this is Dr. Robin signing off. See you next time.